Hello and greetings from the United Kingdom. It's a great pleasure for me to be part of this programme. I only wish I could be with you wherever you are in the world. My work as a researcher involves me working with schools in different parts of the world. The photograph you can see is a picture of some beautiful children in my city of Manchester in the United Kingdom. And this particular school, I know very well, is a very inclusive school. It welcomes all children, whatever their backgrounds, whatever their circumstances, children who speak different languages, some of the children have disabilities. It's a very inclusive school. And what I've tried to do is to learn from schools like this. I've been fortunate in that I've worked in many countries. I have spent time working with some schools, for example, in Sao Paulo, Brazil. I had a wonderful time with schools in that city. I've also worked with schools in Lisbon and Faro in Portugal. So my experience is in all these different schools. And what I try to do is to say, well, what can we learn from these schools? What is it we can take forward? As in every school, every part of the world, we try to develop schools which can reach out to every child in the community. Now, there are no easy answers to this, and I'm not going to give you easy answers, but there are certain patterns which are evident that can help us to think about where we are and how we might move forward. So those are the patterns that I'm going to describe to you. I'm going to explain the things I have seen and noticed in different schools and say these are the things that I think you need to think about. The theme of inclusion and equity is very much on the agenda globally. Over the last 2 decades, the United Nations organizations have promoted the idea of education for all. And they've worked with governments in different parts of the world to promote this idea of education for all. And in the recent documentation, they talk about this being about inclusion and about equity. I worked on a guide which is available on the UNESCO website. It's a guide called Ensuring Inclusion and Inclusion and Equity in Education. And in that guide, we look at what needs to be done to move education systems nationally, locally, and schools individually in a more inclusive direction. In that guide, we proposed a motto, a mantra, if you will, a term which describes what this is all about. And it's there on your screen. It's very simple. Every learner matters and matters equally. Now, that is the principle that guides my work. And that is the principle I'm suggesting you should be thinking about as you try to take your school forward. You see, my argument is that every school is inclusive to some degree. Every school includes some children. So it's a journey. And we have to move forward and say, how can we make our schools such that we can reach out to more children, that we can include them, that we can make them feel welcome, and make them feel that they can learn successfully. So that is the guiding principle that I want you to keep in mind as I talk. Every learner matters and matters equally. Now, from observing schools in these different countries, I would sum it up in terms of 5 factors. These, in my view, are the things that you need to think about when you think about your education system in Brazil and in Portugal and in your local district, but also when you think about your own school. So I'm going to talk about these 5 factors, and I'm going to explain what I think they mean, and I'm going to ask you to think about what these mean as far as your local district is concerned and your particular school. And maybe after this presentation, there'll be time for you to talk to other colleagues and to share ideas about these factors. So these are things that will make a difference in terms of moving schools forward in a more inclusive direction. But I stress again, they are not simple solutions. This is one of the dangers. You see books sometimes, certainly in English. I don't know whether they're in the Portuguese language, and they are simple cookbooks, like the book you get when you're trying to decide what meal you're going to cook in the kitchen. They say, do this, this, and this. They don't work in this area of education. There are no simple cookbooks. There are no simple recipes. These are complex issues, and you have to look at your own context. And the truth is that what will work in one place may not work in another place. So these are factors, ideas. They're not simple things that we have to think about. So the first, and in some ways the most important factor that we need to think about is, what are we trying to achieve here? We're talking about managing change. We're talking about changing our education systems. Now, we know from a lot of research that changing education systems, changing schools is very difficult. Not because teachers are lazy, of course, a few are. Not because teachers are resistant, of course, a few are. Not at all because of those factors. The reason why changing schools and education is difficult is because everybody is so busy. You think about a typical day in your school. I guess you're teaching most of the day. And when you're not teaching, you're planning. And when you're not planning, you're going to meetings. There isn't a lot of time to think and talk about what you're trying to achieve. So that's why achieving change is difficult in education. So we have to be smart at managing change. And we have to understand that change, as far as education is concerned, has to occur at different levels. The government have to promote change. Maybe the local school district has to promote change. The school director has to promote change. But the most important change agents are the teachers in classrooms. As far as the children are concerned, it is the teacher that matters. So if we are to promote inclusion, and I'm saying equity as well, inclusion and equity, we need to be clear what we're saying. And I've already defined it in one way. Every learner matters and matters equally. But let me go a little bit further and say, so what do we mean by inclusive education? For me, inclusive education is a process, not a state. It's a journey, moving forward, trying to develop the capacity of our school to reach out, like the branches of a tree. So as I said earlier, every school is inclusive to some degree. What we're trying to do is move the school further forward to make it even more inclusive. So clarity is crucial. It's a process. It's a process of overcoming barriers. Now, for me, this is crucial. We have to focus on barriers. Now, barriers, the way I'm using the word, is a metaphor. It's asking us to think about what are the things that will obstruct children in terms of them being in the school and participating. And barriers can take many forms. There can be physical barriers. Some children may not be able to get into the school or to get around the school. Some children may not be able to see very well or hear very well. These are barriers and we have to overcome them. But then there are other, even more difficult barriers. The curriculum of the school can be a barrier if it doesn't take account of the interests of all children. The assessment system, how we record progress, can be a barrier if we don't celebrate the progress that all children are making, some of which may be quite slow. The way we teach may be a barrier if we don't know how to design a lesson that will ensure that every child feels that they can contribute. And then there are even more difficult barriers, the barriers in our minds, the limitations of our own expectations of what is possible. These are difficult barriers to identify and difficult barriers to change, but we have to address them. I want to underline one thing, and this is very important. I'm not talking about barriers within children. That is the old thinking. That's the deficit thinking, asking the question, what is wrong with a child? We're throwing that away. We're treating every child as being important, remember. So this is about barriers in the context, barriers in the way we do things in the school. So for me, inclusive education is about identifying and addressing barriers. And then it's about 3 levels. The first level is presence. Who is here in the school? Who is here in the classroom? If you're not present, you can't be included. But that's not enough, because you could be present and you could be overlooked. So the second level of inclusion is about participation, having your voice heard, having your name used, seen as being somebody who is important in the school and in the classroom. So that's the second level. You're present and you're participating. But that's not enough either. True inclusion has to involve progress. It has to include achievement. So we're talking about the presence, participation, and achievement of all children. So inclusive education, be very clear, in my definition, is about all children, including some that we may be overlooking. But of course, we know that some children are particularly vulnerable, so we have to keep a particular eye on those children. So this is the thinking, the new thinking about inclusive education. It's about changes in the context of the school and changes in the context of the classroom. And we have to be clear about that if we're going to make progress. The second important factor, essential factor then, is the use of evidence. We need to know what is happening in our school. We need to know what's happening in our classroom. So we need to count things. We need statistics. We know which children are here today, which children are missing, which children are being naughty, bad behavior, which children are not making progress in their work. Now, the use of evidence is a powerful lever for moving things forward. And the evidence has to be connected to our definition of equity and inclusion. Remember what I've said. It's a process of overcoming barriers to improve the presence, participation, and achievement of all children. So we need evidence about the presence, participation, and achievement of all children. Now, the work I do with schools involves me in helping teachers to use what I'll call action research, where teachers are collecting evidence by observing one another's teaching, by listening to the children, by listening to the families, and collecting evidence so that we have a greater understanding of what is creating barriers to progress of our children. Now, for me, that has to go on in your school. You have to become a school that is an inquiring school, a school that is carrying out a form of teacher-led action research. So that leads me to my third very important factor, support for teachers. I've already said, teachers are policymakers. If we're going to make progress in relation to inclusion, we have to feel that teachers are central to this, and we have to support them. In the most successful education systems in the world, it's very clear. In those systems, teachers are highly valued. They're seen in the community as being very important. They may not be very well paid, but they have status. And I think this is crucial to what we're talking about. And those of you who are in leadership positions, perhaps some of you are school directors, part of your job is to make sure that your teachers feel valued and supported, and that you celebrate the work that they're doing. But then you create an atmosphere in the school where teachers are sharing ideas and experimenting with new approaches to reach children that we're not reaching at the moment. So this is where my idea of action research becomes collaborative. It's not teachers doing action research on their own, it's teachers working in groups, planning together, collaborating, thinking about what else can we do to reach those children we're not reaching at the moment. So teachers are at the heart of any progress we're going to make in relation to developing more inclusive schools. It's about teacher development, it's about school development, and therefore leadership is absolutely crucial. Teachers have to have a chance to plan together, they have to have a chance to see one another teaching occasionally, and they have a chance then to talk about what they've seen when they observe one another teaching. This is how the kind of action research I'm talking about. It's very informal, it's very participative. And school leaders, directors, have to make that happen. They have to create the relationships, the trust, and the time for it to happen. Sometimes when I'm talking to school directors in conferences, people will say to me, well, I agree with what you're saying, Mel, but we don't have any time. And I always say, well, then you don't agree with me. If you agree with me, you would find the time. Time is the currency we use in schools to signal that something is important. There is no time. Everybody's busy. If we know something is important, we find the time. And my challenge to school directors is this. If you want to improve the learning of your children, pay attention to the professional learning of your teachers. All of that is about the development of the individual school and the individual classroom. But I think then we have to think about how that is coordinated at the local level. We've a lot of evidence now from different countries, including Portugal, where you have a strong tradition of what you call school clusters, of how schools can work together and support one another and share ideas. So I'm starting by saying, carry out action research and collaborate in your school. But then I'm saying, go further than that. Work with another school, or maybe a group of schools, in a cluster, in a network, in a partnership, where people from different schools are learning from one another. What the research has shown very clearly is that schools can be very powerful in helping and supporting one another. So we have to open the gate. As well as teachers seeing one another teaching, schools have to see one another working. And in that way, local ideas can be strengthened. Now that needs local coordination. In the international research literature, they talk about the need for a middle tier, a middle level, if you will. Now this will look different in different countries. It can be the local authority that provides that, or it can be partnerships between schools. I think, for example, in Portugal, the clusters provide a marvelous possibility for creating this kind of local coordination where schools are working with one another. Which leads me to the fifth and final of my points that I want to make. What I've talked about so far is the development of practice within schools. I then talked about the development of practice between schools through collaboration. The third part of all that is beyond the school gate, in the community. First, of course, it's working with families. Successful schools that become more inclusive see partners, parents and other family members, could be brothers and sisters, it can be grandparents. They see families as partners, and they involve partners. Because the schools know that the families know things about the children that the teachers don't know. They also know that families influence children's progress in learning. So it's working with families, but then it goes beyond families. There are all sorts of other people in the community who can help us. We need to work with the local religious groups, the churches, the mosques, the temples. They have an involvement in families and children's lives. We need to work with local businesses and industry. We need to work with the political community locally. We need to work with universities. Universities can get involved. Much of my work from the university is working as a partner with schools, helping them on their journey to becoming more inclusive. So I encourage you to look carefully at whether you are making enough use of representatives of your local community and involving them in your efforts to become more inclusive. So to sum up, I'm saying that inclusion in education is a journey. It's a process. We're all on the journey and we all have to move forward. And it's about managing change, and it's about collaboration. This is about school improvement. I hope you can see that. Inclusive education is school improvement. Now, in the world of school improvement, it is often said school improvement is technically simple, but socially complex. Technically simple, but socially complex. It's not that difficult to explain what needs to happen. Here's my version of it today, the 5 factors that I'm saying you should work on. That's the easy bit. The complex bit is getting everybody involved, everybody pulling in the same direction, everybody agreeing to collaborate. So my final conclusion about efforts to move in a more inclusive direction is it requires a collective effort. It requires a collective will to make it happen. Teachers have to work with teachers. Children have to work with children. Schools have to work with other schools. Schools have to work with families and the wider community. And it's the collective will to make it happen. That's what will make a difference. I hope that is useful, and I hope you will get a chance to discuss these ideas. It's a pleasure to have met you. Thank you.